are making this program for the students of tourism. Tourism industry in India is growing very rapidly. Tourism as an industry has become a major economic force. But as part of tourism course, as part of your tourism study, it is very important for you to get very comprehensive understanding about what is communication. Let me first introduce you to the importance and the significance of communication. All of us are born into a society and will have to live with it or opt for another society. In either case, there is a society to live with. As members of society, we will have to establish relationships with individuals, with groups of institutions, either permanently or in a temporary basis. I have used a very important expression. In communication, we have to establish relationships with individuals, with groups or institutions. That is what communication is all about. Communication helps us to belong to a society and benefit by such relationships. Communication simply means moving and receiving messages. In other words, in communication, we are giving messages and we are receiving messages, or information from one point to another point. All individuals communicate with one another. They may also communicate with others as members of a group. In other words, we are sometimes involved in a group communication. Individuals also communicate with organization and with larger audiences. I've used an important word, audience. Communication does not exist without audience. Communication is for people. In communication, you've got to know your audience, your target audience. In the case of tourism, you've got to know your target audience. Some of them are interested in going on a pilgrimage. Some of them are going on, seeing, some heritage buildings. And they need to get to know that specific information relating to the target audience. The target audience here, they are interested in tourism, tourism spots, pilgrimage centers, they are interested in forts, they are interested in temples, they are interested in churches, they are interested in mass. So, you need to communicate with them about various aspects relating to tourism which are available in India or abroad. Individuals also communicate with an organization with larger audience. Therefore, there are a number of situations in which communication takes place. It's important for you to understand communication does not take place in isolation. Communication takes place in a context. The context being, where are you communicating, to whom are you communicating, with what kind of audience you are communicating. That is where it's important for you to understand there are a number of situations in which communication takes place, and you need to understand that situation for effective communication. It's also important for you to understand that man is a social animal. He is social by nature. The foundation of a society is based on communication. Communication is not only essential for human beings, but for all living groups, including birds, bees, fish, animals, and plants. In other words, we cannot imagine the existence or expansion of life without communication. It is the effective communication system developed by human beings that made them special from the rest of living beings. Communication has a very vital role to play in a society. What does communication do? It can bring people closer to each other. In the absence of communication, it may also create a gap like or a wall between individuals and societies. In other words, if there is no communication, there is a blockade, there is a wall between individuals and society. In this episode, we are making an attempt to explain what is the nature of communication and the various facets, various definitions of communication. We are going to be introducing you to the definition and concepts of communication. We are going to be making you acquaint with various facets of communication. We are going to be comprehensively defining communication, to explain the concept of communication, and also explain the importance of communication in a society. Communication is a basic instinct of life. Very important for you to understand. Communication is a basic instinct of life. It's a fact of life, not only for human beings, but also for animals and plants. It's an ever-continuing process, and it is fundamental and going on all the time. Communication is going on all the time in society. Animals communicate, birds communicate, beasts communicate by singing, by croaking, and by other sounds. Sound also is a method of communication. Communication also takes place through visuals, to signs and signals. In other words, when we are talking about communication, we are also talking about verbal communication and non-verbal communication. Communication does not take place only through words. Non-verbal communication also, such as symbols communicate, signs communicate, gestures communicate. Communication has two major forms of verbal communication and non-verbal communication. That is where it is important for us to explain that communication is a social process, and it is fundamental and vital for human survival. We cannot think about surviving in a society. It is fundamental because every human society, whether modern or primitive, is founded on the capacity of its members to maintain a working consensus about the social order through communication. A social order in a society can only take place through a communication. A social harmony can only take place in a society through communication. So, we give communication in the name, we give to the countless ways that humans have of keeping in touch. Relationships are established through communication. When we are talking about communication, not just words, music communicates, pictures communicate. There's something called print, which communicates. Postures communicate. Through gestures, you communicate. Every move that catches someone's eye and every sound resonates upon another's ear is communication. Look at the wider scope of communication. Sound communicates, touch communicates. Through words, we are communicating. Through our body language, we are communicating. Through our gestures, we are communicating. That is where communication has a wider connotation and a wider meaning. Communication also takes place in a social, political, economic, and a cultural context. When we talk about communication, you need to understand in what kind of a society you are communicating, in what kind of a cultural context you are communicating. As long as we do not understand the context in which you are communicating, the nature of people we are communicating, our communication cannot be very effective. In communication, we are trying to establish human relationship. Through communication, we are trying to influence people, motivate people. Through communication, we are trying to give information. Another important aspect in terms of communication, we are also trying to build up public opinion through communication. When we are talking about culturally, communication is a means of individual and community expression, discovery and enrichment and recreation. Communication includes all methods of disseminating information, knowledge, thought, attitudes, beliefs through any media or through communication. A great deal of communication takes place today in the world and also in India through modern mass media. We have identified 5 important dimensions in terms of communication. By communication, we are disseminating information, number 1. Number 2, by communication, we are giving knowledge. And then number 3, we are trying to give a certain thought. And number 4, attitudes and beliefs. Communication is the form of interaction that takes place through symbols. I also talked about non-verbal communication. Communication also takes place through symbols. The symbols may be gestures, pictures, they can be any kind of a non-verbal communication. The point we are trying to explain is communication is a multifaceted activity and a term that has several meanings. It encompasses all forms of expression for serving the purpose of mutual understanding. Communication enables a person to enter into a meaningful relationship with other persons. Through communication, we are trying to establish a relationship with other persons. And in the process of communication, we are also exchanging experiences with them. Where does this word communication come from? Communication comes from a Latin word, communis. Simply, communis means sharing, commonness. That's the meaning. It's a Latin word. The meaning of communication itself is sharing and trying to establish a commonness. Now, let us try to look at various definitions of communication. As I've said, the word communication originates from a Latin word, communis, meaning common. Simply, communication means commonness. So, communication is an act by which person shares with others knowledge, feelings, ideas, and information. What are we doing by communicating? We are trying to communicate knowledge. We are trying to communicate feelings and emotions. Through communication, we are trying to give ideas. And through communication, we are trying to give information. Let us look at some of the definitions which have been given by various scholars and thinkers relating to communication. The very basic definition of communication is, it is transmission of information, ideas, attitudes, or emotions, one person to a group to another, primarily through symbols. Second definition of communication, communication is a social interaction through messages. If there is no message, communication cannot take place. Another way of looking at communication, communication is a process by which 2 or more people exchange ideas, facts, feelings, or impressions in ways that each gains a common understanding of the message. Another way of looking at communication is, by communication, we are trying to establish commonness. Communication is a process by which information, decisions, directions pass through a social system and the ways in which knowledge, opinions, attitudes are formed or modified. Look at the role communication plays. By communication, attitudes are formed or attitudes are changed. Why are we trying to communicate? We are trying to communicate primarily to give information. By information, we are trying to influence people, and by giving information, we are trying to see they change their attitudes or they modify their attitude. Communication plays a very significant role. Communication is a force by which individuals communicate or transmit stimuli to modify the behavior of other individuals. By communication, we are trying to change other individuals. And by communication, there is a social interaction. That social interaction involves the transmission of meanings through the usage of symbols is known as communication. We are also using symbols in terms of communication. Communication is anything that conveys meaning, that carries a message from one person to another person. A very simple definition of communication. Communication is anything that conveys meaning, that carries a message from one person to another person. Communication is the mutual interchange of ideas by any effective means. Communication is the control of behavior through descriptive and reinforcing stimuli. We are also reinforcing by communicating. Sometimes we send the message 2 times or 3 times. What are we doing by trying to send that message by 2 times or 3 times? By reinforcing the message. Sometimes a person does not understand a message, we repeat the message again. So, we are trying to reinforce. Communication is a process effecting an interchange of understanding between 2 or more people. Communication is a purposeful process which involves source, message, channel and receiver. In communication, there is a source, number 1. Number 2, there is a message. Number 3, there is a channel and there is a receiver. We will talk about these 4 dimensions more comprehensively. Communication is imparting or interchanging of thoughts, opinion, information by speech. Through my presentation, through my speech, I am trying to give you some thoughts, I am trying to give you some opinion, I am trying to give you some information. Communication can take place through speech, through writing or through signs. Communication is the broad field of human interchange of facts and opinion. Through communication, we are exchanging thoughts. It's a human interchange of facts and opinion. Communication is the process of passing information and understanding from one person to another. What are we doing in the process of communication? We are imparting ideas, making oneself understood by others. When we looked at the definition of communication, communication is to establish commonness, communication is to establish relationship. By communication, we are giving knowledge, emotion, ideas. By communication, we are giving them thoughts. So, when we understand the purpose of communication, when you are communicating with your target audience in the tourism industry, when you are communicating with your tourists, you will be in a position to make use of all these factors of communication so that your communication can be effective and meaningful. Let us look at some of the 4 characteristics of communication. Communication is continuous, number 1. 2, communication is personal, communication is circular, communication is irreversible. Communication is a continuous process. Every day we are communicating in a societal context, communicating in an organization, communicating in an office, communicating with a family. Communication, that's where is a continuous process. Communication is also personal. It's an intimate process. We are communicating in a personal way. And communication is circular. And communication is irreversible. Once communication has taken place, once we have communicated with audience, particularly in the case of mass media, if you have communicated a message, it grows to millions of people. And is it irreversible? We cannot correct that. It becomes difficult for us to correct that communication. That is where we need to ensure, we need to take care to see that communication has facts. That is where communication, we should be in a position to communicate meaningfully. In communication, there must be clarity. We are communicating for people. We are communicating with certain target audience. And we need to be very, very careful when we are communicating. The nature of language we use, the nature of words we use, the nature of symbols we use, we need to be very careful so that we can communicate meaningfully and effectively. we got a thorough understanding about what is communication, different aspects of communication. Now, it is important for us to look at what are the elements which go into communication. If you understand these basic elements which go into communication, you will be in a position to present yourself very effectively in communication. There are 4 major elements in communication process. Source, the source wishing to say something. Then the second important factor is the message. The third important factor, the channel. The fourth important factor is the receiver. That is called SMCR, process of communication. Source, message, channel, receiver. The source is wanting to say something. Source is the originator of message. Where is the message coming from? That is the source. Then the message. The message you want to convey, the information you want to give as part of your message. Then the channel. The channel is how do you want to communicate? Is it through interpersonal communication? Is it through group communication? It is through what is the medium you want to use for communication? The important factor in communication is the receiver, for whom the message is meant for. Whom are you targeting your message? Who are your target audience for communication is important in terms of the receivers. Source, message, channel and receivers. One of the basic functions of communication is an information function. It is an instructive function. It is influencing people. Through communication, we are trying to persuade people, and it is also an integrative function. No society or community can survive without communication. Communication is important for all of them. The word communication originates from a Latin word communis, meaning commonness. Communication is a continuous process because there is no time when person stops communicating. All the time we are communicating. Communication is personal because we are communicating with a certain section of people. Communication is irreversible because once something is said or written and reaches the receiver, the act becomes irreversible. That's where we said we need to be careful when we are communicating. Communication is a process of social interaction. We are all the time interacting with the people. And in other words, societies cannot exist without communication. Communication is basic to life itself.